Hello everyone. In this lecture we're going to continue on our requirement elicitation progress, and we're going to touch on interviewing. Now this isn't interviewing for a job, but it's very similar because you have structured questions that you utilize to go through and identify and elicit requirements. So let's jump right in. What is interviewing? Interviewing is a discussion that you're utilizing to drive out requirements. And what interviewing does is allows you to do it quickly and identify those requirements and get those ideas written down as part of what that person is thinking. With interviewing, you can understand high-level needs. You can understand constraints and assumptions based on the questions you're asking and the details you're able to get back from that particular stakeholder. What's nice with the interview is you're reducing some misunderstandings because you're talking to a person generally face-to-face. It could be over phone or over a webcam potentially, but most of the time it's done face-to-face in an office. You're able to help and make sure that you're understanding what they're saying and they're understanding what you're saying. So if you're using some type of vocabulary or acronyms or anything like that, they can say, wait a minute, what does that mean? Where in a large group setting, in like a requirements workshop, they're not going to probably feel comfortable saying, hey, what does that acronym mean? Because they're going to feel stupid, like maybe they should have known that. And so they're going to tend to speak up a lot less likely, so you're not going to get as much value from them. So in the interview, you're able to gather some of that information from them, and they're able to feel comfortable asking some of those additional questions. So it helps reduce some of the misunderstandings. Also, this interview, a lot of times you think of it one-on-one, right? Interviews one-on-one, that's what most business job interviews are. So personally, that's what I picture, and I think a lot of you are as well. But this also could be in a group setting. This could also be a couple people, 2, 3, 4 people that you're interviewing and kind of asking them and eliciting feedback and requirements from that full group rather than just one person. More often than not, I see this used as like 1 or 2 people, and I prefer not to really go above 2 people very often. 2 people is great. I guess sometimes I've added a third, but I like to keep to no more than 2 people if I can help it. It just helps to keep the conversation going and nobody feels like they're being overpowered by anyone else. So interviews can be formal or informal, and most of the time, I like them to be more informal, not because that's just my style as a business analyst to be a little bit more laid back, that's my personality, but also because you get a little bit more openness and people tend to give you their real kind of thoughts, regardless of political boundaries or, they don't feel like they're going to get in trouble, like you're going to run and tell their boss that they don't follow this certain process that they're supposed to. It's very important for you to know that this process may be in place, but if nobody's following that process or if certain people have kind of gone outside that process, why? There's got to be a reason for it. Is it a system? Is it the process? And by kind of having that one-on-one and being a little bit more informal and laid back, I tend to be able to draw out a little bit more of that information from them as they feel comfortable talking to me. But you also could have a very formal interview, especially maybe if you're talking to somebody in executive management, where they're going to be more interested in a formal interview, and that's kind of what they expect. Another thing with the interview is that you're able to see the process or requirements from the interviewee's perspective. So that's really nice, is to be able to say, we understand and maybe we've identified this process, but what do you feel about it? Does this work? Is there anything that you feel that we can do to help this? So it just helps to kind of bring out some more ideas, and you're able to get some specific pinpoint ideas of what that person or that small group is thinking about your current processes and systems and what have you, or what they want in their future ones. There's a lot of different types of interviews, and the first one is a personal interview. So this is where you're going through and you're asking some scripted questions, and you're documenting the interviewee's responses. A lot of these questions are going to be, or they should be, open-ended questions. So you're asking them, if you could do anything with this system, what would it be? You're asking an open-ended question, not saying, are you on board with doing a new system? If you're asking a question they can answer yes or no to, that's not a good question. We'll get into a little bit more of the scripted questions and what's important in those. But in the personal interviews, you should have scripted questions, and you should be asking multiple stakeholders, multiple users of that same group, the same set of questions. And the key thing is there, by doing that, you're able to validate that all the responses are the same or they're not the same. And if they're not, then you've got some conflicts, and you've got some potential things to work through in your analysis step to validate why and can we account for these different things, or what have you. So that's your personal interviews. One other thing with that is you can validate requirements, and you can remove assumptions. And that's just because you can ask clarifying questions while you're sitting there with them, and it just makes it easier. And like I mentioned earlier, it's more of an interview that people tend to be a little bit more open with. Another thing that can be considered an interview is job shadowing. So this is actually walking through a workday with a user or a user group and observing them. I've done this numerous times. I like to do this early on in projects and just say, hey, let me walk around with you for a half day, for a full day, whatever that is. Generally a half day is plenty, or a couple hours. And I want you just to work through your day as normal. I'm just going to ask you some questions. And what you're able to do then is understand the systems they're using, the processes they're using. Maybe you could identify some of those challenges that they don't even realize are challenges because, well, that's just the way we've always done it. So you can identify some of that and help to wrap your arms around, what they're running into and kind of be able to work through that. As well with job shadowing, I like to do that and then later on do a personal interview with that person. So with the job shadowing, I'm able to make some assumptions. I'm able to see how they work. And then I'm able to set up that personal interview to ask some clarifying questions and some detailed questions about what they do and why they do things a certain way, or what they'd like to see in their new system, where if I wouldn't have done that job shadowing, I wouldn't have been able to ask those specific questions. Also, one other thing with job shadowing is you get to go in their life. So they live and breathe that every day, and you can give them some appreciation for what they do. Well, that's great. I can't believe you do that every day. That's awesome. And you're able to build some rapport and relationship with them that then you can utilize not only if you do a personal interview, but later on throughout the project. They're kind of getting on board with you, that they trust that you have their best interest in mind, and they're a little bit more apt to change. So the user adoption gets a little bit easier later on in the process when you get into your implementation phases. Another thing is a customer site visit. So if you're doing this project and it's part of a customer maybe that hired you, you could go and understand the operational environment they work in. And that helps you to understand some of those environmental constraints that you may run into, and kind of work through that, as well as you can understand kind of where they go, what they do, what they're walking through on a daily basis, and see how that all works. So that's another fun thing to do. I don't do that one too often. Most of the time, the people that I'm working with are working at sites that I'm at least vaguely familiar with. So a customer site visit isn't usually as important. But I've heard of that being done, especially for like consultants that work for me. They go do a customer site visit and kind of walk through that and see the day in the life of the customer and what kind of environment they work in. Another thing is you can do a task analysis, which is different than a job shadow. So a job shadow, you're more a shadow, right? You're not going to ask too many questions. I mentioned that you may ask them a couple questions about the system, and that's okay. You want to get some clarifications, but you don't want to be, drilling them with questions. Where a task analysis, you're pulling that user away from their job and you're saying, okay, walk through your current jobs. Tell me what you're doing Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays. Is there anything you do on a weekly basis, a monthly basis? Yes. Okay. What's that process? How do you complete that task? And by having them walk through that, you're able to identify, usually pretty easily, some areas where just alarm bells are going off for you to say, wow, why are they doing it that way? We could do that so much easier by handling it this, or we could grant so much efficiency by reducing this or cutting this out or moving this around or whatever that is. And so the task analysis helps to identify that. Task analysis could be something that you do in a room, so you pull them away from their work area and you do it in a room. It could also be where you go sit with them in their workspace and work through it. One thing to consider with the task analysis, if you do it at their workspace, it's nice because you see them and they can actually show you in their systems and pull up the paperwork or whatever they have to fill out as part of that task. And you may be able to identify additional things, but you run the inherent risk of people bugging them, right? They're on the floor, they're in their office, they're in their cubicle, or wherever this is, and people could be bugging them for their normal job where you want to have their full undivided attention, giving you the information you're looking for and the requirements. So if you pull them into a room, you kind of seclude them and get them away from there so people aren't finding them and bugging them, but you kind of remove them from their habitat, if you will. So you may not see as much detail as what you're looking for. As well, with the task analysis, you can identify that as-is process and identify the frequent tasks, like I kind of mentioned. And you can ask a lot of questions to understand what works well and what doesn't. So I think I covered that in detail. That should make a lot of sense. So those are the types: the personal interview, one-on-one or with a group, scripted questions, job shadowing. You're not asking many questions. You're kind of walking through a life in the day of with a person and just saying, just work, I'm just here shadowing. You may be shadowing a couple different groups in the same day and kind of bouncing around between them, and you're just observing, taking some notes. Customer site visits, you're going on site to a location maybe that's not familiar to you and seeing their environmental kind of situation and how the office is set up. And then the task analysis, you're either pulling them away from their workspace, or you're going to their workspace and having them walk through the tasks that they do on a daily basis. So not just allowing them to work, you're having them focus entirely on you and walking through those tasks to help identify potential opportunities in the as-is processes and areas of that efficiencies can be gained from. So those are interviewing types. So what are some advantages and disadvantages? I've alluded to some of these as we've kind of worked forward, but I'll go through them just to make sure. The one thing is you can interact with people. So interactive discussions, you're one-on-one or one in a small group, so you're able to ask those questions, work through it, and it really helps to build that rapport and build that relationship with them. In addition, you can identify conflicts or discrepancies in requirements as stated by other people. So, like I mentioned, if you have the same scripted questions, maybe let's just say 5 questions, and you ask them to multiple people in that department in the same type of role, and you get a couple different answers, alarm bells should be going off that something's wrong. The requirements that you're getting aren't consistent. So either some users are misinformed or they do things a wrong way or a different way, but you at least need to be aware of that and account for that as you walk forward. Another thing is you're encouraging participation and building rapport with them. We kind of mentioned that. You're able to observe nonverbal behavior. So sometimes people may tense up at certain discussions around certain processes. Well, that should throw off some red flags for you that maybe that process, they say, oh, well, that's okay. That's kind of the way we do it, right? That's showing you that they're maybe not completely happy with that. Or it helps you to identify that nonverbal body language and language of the person when you're sitting across and observing them, and you can make some assumptions there, make some decisions, as well as prompt some additional discussions. And then the nice thing is you can allow for immediate follow-up to ensure understanding. So you ask a question, they answer, you can reiterate that, take that, re-summarize it, and say it back to them and have them, oh yeah, yep, that's what I meant, that's perfect. And now you're ensuring your understanding of what they're stating, rather than in a requirements workshop or in a brainstorming, you're just getting ideas and you're kind of not able to potentially really ensure what your understanding is of what they're stating. So if this is so great, why don't we do it all the time? Well, here's some of the disadvantages with it. One big thing is you need to have access to the stakeholders to be able to do this. You're pulling potentially a number of users or a number of stakeholders off of their normal duties for 1 to a few hours to work through this. So this project needs to be a high priority, and the stakeholders and the business needs to be aware of kind of the burden that it's going to put on the current business, but ultimately that's for the better of the company and the better of for this new system or project that you're completing. So you need to have that kind of tie-in there, as well as you need to have the tie-in from that individual person to set aside the time and take it seriously and know that they're there and they can really provide some assistance for you. The next thing is creating the scripted questions for the interviews can be time consuming. You have to do a little bit of research. You have to make sure that your questions are well thought out and detailed. So that can be time consuming to write good quality open-ended questions. Another thing is stakeholders sometimes have a tough time of describing what they really want. So they tend to discuss what it is today. Well, this is how we do it today. Okay, well, what do you want it to be? Well, I don't know. What we do today is fine, right? Where it may not be fine, but it's hard for them to picture that what that could be and what the possibility is. And so somebody that, as a business analyst, they may say, well, that's crazy. Why are you doing this way? It could be done so much easier. And the person says, oh yeah, that sounds great. But they never would have thought of that on their own. They don't know what they don't know. And it's hard for them to picture that future without kind of prompting them there. Another thing is the documentation is subject to interpretation by the interviewer. So once they write it all up, now you're kind of subjecting it to interpretation of the person reading it. Honestly, it's a disadvantage, but that goes for all requirements, right? Anybody reading it is kind of subject to interpretation. So I kind of take that with a grain of salt, and I'm not as concerned that way. If I'm writing good requirements, if I'm writing the answers and getting clarification, I have a pretty good understanding of what they're stating. And then last but not least is that the transcription of analysis can be complex and expensive. So you ask all these interviews, right? So let's just say you do 15 interviews. Well, now you took all that time to prep for the interview. You took all that time to conduct the interviews. You took all that time to do a quick debrief with yourself and maybe your scribe, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And now you need to analyze all that data and kind of come up with, requirements and conflicts and all those pieces to make some decisions off of it. Well, that could be really expensive and extremely time consuming to do that. So sometimes that can outweigh the costs. So I hope that helps. That's part 1 of the interviewing. In the next lecture, we'll get into the part 2.